Gavin Preston wasn't your average street thug. He played a different game. Bigger moves, louder headlines, and a reputation that had people in Melbourne's underworld either fearing him, backing him, or trying to get rid of him. If you've been following the news, you might have caught his name linked to gangland shootings, prison time, and a stack of whispered rumors about who he was connected to and who he crossed. But behind all that chaos and violence, there's this strange contrast. A guy who apparently once dreamed of living a normal life. This story's not about just another criminal, it's about power, betrayal, revenge, and the fine line between being feared and being hunted. Gavin Preston's name didn't just land in the headlines overnight. It took years of rising through Melbourne's darkest corners to get there. And it came with a price. There isn't a whole lot out there about Gavin Preston's early days, and that's pretty on brand for someone who moved in silence, at least at the start. What we do know is that his life didn't exactly follow the straight and narrow. He grew up in Melbourne, and somewhere along the line, something, or someone, pulled him into the world of crime. It wasn't flashy at first. Like a lot of others who end up in that scene, it started with small-time stuff. But it didn't take long for Preston to make it clear he wasn't just another background player. He had ambition, the kind that gets noticed in the wrong circles. He earned a nickname, too. Capable. Not because he was nice with words, but because when something needed doing, he got it done. By his 20s, Preston was already showing up on police radars. Armed robberies, assaults, the sort of things that let people in the underworld know you weren't afraid to get your hands dirty. But even then, it wasn't just about violence. He played it smart, patient, calculated. That's what made him dangerous. In Melbourne's underworld, blood ties can be stronger than loyalty, but also way messier. And for someone like Gavin Preston, who operated in a world where alliances shifted like sand, family grudges weren't just personal, they were deadly. A lot of the tension around Preston didn't just come from rivals on the street. Some of it boiled up from deeper issues. Old arguments, past betrayals, and family histories that were never really left in the past. If someone in the crew felt wronged, or if a relative had beef from back in the day, it didn't just disappear, it festered. These weren't movie-style vendettas with dramatic showdowns. They were quiet, behind-the-scenes fallouts that built up over time. One bad move, one wrong word, and suddenly what should have been a tight circle turned into something a lot more dangerous. For Preston, navigating those personal ties may have been just as risky as dealing with enemies on the outside. It's the kind of thing that can push a situation from tense to explosive without warning. As Gavin Preston moved up in the underworld, his name started showing up more and more alongside words like suspect and person of interest. He wasn't just some low-level enforcer anymore. He was now part of serious conversations around some of the city's most violent crimes. Over time, his involvement in gangland hits became harder to ignore. People close to him started dropping, some gunned down in broad daylight. Cops were sure these weren't random attacks. These were targeted, well-timed, and cold. And in the middle of it all, the name Preston kept floating back to the surface. But what made these murders stand out wasn't just the violence, it was who the victims were. A few were well-known names in Melbourne's underworld, old-school guys with serious pull. So when they were taken out, it didn't just cause panic, it shifted the balance of power. Every hit sparked a chain reaction, allies turned into suspects, quiet rivalries turned into open threats. And even though Preston rarely got caught holding the smoking gun, everyone knew he wasn't far from the action. The kind of influence he had meant he didn't need to pull the trigger himself. All it took was a nod, a phone call, or even just silence. That was enough. By this point, fear started doing the talking. Some people steered clear. Others tried to get close, hoping it'd protect them. But either way, one thing was clear. When someone crossed Preston, things didn't end with words. If Gavin Preston's life felt like it was building toward something big, that moment came on a quiet Saturday morning in Keilor East. It was September 2023. A cafe on a regular Melbourne street, people eating breakfast, sipping coffee, normal weekend stuff. Then 2 men pulled up. What happened next was fast and brutal. Preston was shot multiple times. Another man sitting with him, his associate, was hit too. Preston didn't make it. This wasn't a messy, unplanned outburst. It looked like a hit, clean, confident, and carried out in front of witnesses. Whoever ordered it wasn't worried about subtlety. The timing, the location, even the fact that Preston had been out of prison not long before, it all pointed to something way bigger than a random shooting. And it raised questions. Who would take that kind of risk? Who had the motive, the nerve, and the backing to go after a guy like Preston in public? It didn't take long before police had their eyes on a few names. Surveillance footage, phone records, and old rivalries all came into play. One man was arrested just weeks later, and another followed in April 2024. Both were linked to known crime circles. Still, that didn't answer everything. Some people believe this wasn't just a personal feud. It might have been part of a shift in control, a way to send a message. For years, Preston had operated like he was untouchable. That morning proved he wasn't. But what made it even more chilling wasn't just that he was killed, it was how fast it all happened and how quiet the response was from people who used to stand beside him. No one rushed to fill the gap he left, not right away. And that silence, that said a lot. Before bullets ended Gavin Preston's story, handcuffs nearly did. His criminal record read like a checklist of serious offenses: armed robbery, violent assault, firearm possession, and suspected involvement in several murders. This wasn't someone who got caught shoplifting. Preston spent years in and out of prison, and every time he came out, the streets seemed to pick up right where he left off. He wasn't just known to police, he was watched closely. Task forces, wiretaps, surveillance teams. Preston was on the radar of pretty much every law enforcement unit that dealt with gang crime in Victoria. And yet, time and again, he managed to avoid long-term convictions for the most serious stuff. There was always just enough doubt or just enough fear from witnesses to keep the biggest charges from sticking. But not everything slipped through the cracks. In 2012, he was handed a hefty sentence: 10 years. Armed robbery, drugs, and other charges finally caught up to him. That was the longest stretch he served. Inside, his reputation only grew. He kept ties strong, built new ones, and never really left the game. When he was finally released in 2022, some people figured he might have tried to lay low, start over. But that wasn't Preston. If anything, the pace picked up. There were whispers that he was back in business, possibly settling old debts or even stepping into a bigger role in the underworld now that other major players were either locked up or dead. The law didn't back off either. Police moved quickly, especially after his name came up again in new investigations. In fact, some of the cases connected to his inner circle were being fast-tracked. That's not something that happens for just any suspect. It usually means investigators think there's real danger in waiting around. Still, there was always this sense that Preston stayed one step ahead, until he didn't. If you lived in Melbourne, you didn't have to be deep into crime stories to know who Gavin Preston was. His name showed up in news reports, headlines, late-night talk shows, usually next to words like feared, infamous, or deadly. But depending on who you asked, people saw him very differently. To some, he was just another dangerous thug, another face in a long line of underworld figures who caused chaos and hurt a lot of people. They saw the reports, the arrests, the trail of violence, and thought, why is this guy still walking around? But to others, especially those caught up in that world, Preston had a strange kind of respect around him. Not admiration, more like recognition. He was known for keeping things under control, for settling disputes when things got out of hand, and for not being afraid to act when someone stepped out of line. It was like people feared him and relied on him. The media didn't hold back either. Once his name became attached to big cases and high-profile shootings, he became part of the larger gangland narrative, another chapter in Melbourne's history of crime families, unsolved murders, and violent reckonings. Some papers painted him as a criminal mastermind. Others framed him as a symptom of something broken, someone created by a system that let crime fester in certain parts of the city for too long. But the most interesting thing, despite all the coverage, all the headlines, the full story never quite came out. Everyone knew parts of it. No one knew all of it. And that's what made Preston's name linger, even after he was gone. With Gavin Preston now out of the picture, the story didn't just end, it cracked open. His death didn't bring closure. If anything, it stirred up even more uncertainty in a world already loaded with tension and shifting alliances. In the months after the cafe shooting, police moved fast. They weren't just trying to close the case, they were trying to stop whatever might come next. Because in gangland terms, someone like Preston getting taken out publicly, in broad daylight, isn't just a murder, it's a power move. And power moves rarely go unanswered. 2 men have since been arrested in connection with the hit. One was picked up just weeks after the shooting, another more recently, in April 2024. Both had known links to organized crime. That's as far as the official story goes. But on the street, the theories are louder than the facts. Some believe this was payback for a past betrayal. Others think Preston was getting too close to old enemies or making moves that made people nervous. Maybe both. Then there's the question of what happens now. With someone like Preston gone, there's a gap, one that doesn't stay empty for long. Melbourne's underworld has always worked like that. Remove one piece, and 3 others shift to take its place. It's not just about who fills the space, it's about how they do it, and what they're willing to do to keep it. There's also unfinished business. People loyal to Preston, others who feared him, some who might have owed him. That web of tension doesn't just disappear overnight, and while the headlines have started moving on, those left behind in his circle, they haven't. Not really. Whatever comes next might not be about Preston directly, but it'll be built on the foundations he helped lay, and possibly the mess he left behind. Gavin Preston didn't live a quiet life, and he sure didn't leave quietly either. His story was one of power, pressure, and survival in a world where loyalty is thin and every decision could be your last. He wasn't just a criminal. He was part of something bigger, something tangled in old grudges, shifting alliances, and streets where silence often speaks louder than sirens. His name now sits among Melbourne's long list of infamous underworld figures. But, unlike a lot of the others, he didn't fade out slowly or disappear into the background. He was taken out in broad daylight, in a cafe full of people, like a final exclamation mark on a violent career. There are still gaps in the story, things that'll probably never come out in court or news reports. And maybe that's the part that sticks the most. The idea that someone like Preston, with all his history and all his enemies, could go down the way he did and still leave more questions than answers. If this shows us anything, it's that Melbourne's underworld isn't something frozen in time. It keeps moving, rebuilding, evolving, and just when it feels like a chapter has closed, something else cracks open.